Okay, so this video is on trigonometric ratios. You've seen these in geometry class. This is sine, cosine, and tangent. We're talking about right triangles in this video. So let me just remind you that the sine of, I'm going to use x as this angle here. The sine of x is the ratio of the opposite side over the hypotenuse. So in this case, if you're talking about this x right here, the opposite side is this one right here. In relation to the x, this is the opposite side. This is the hypotenuse. The hypotenuse is always the, I said this in a previous video, is always opposite from the 90-degree angle, and it's always the longest side. So the sine of this angle, x, is the opposite over the hypotenuse. The cosine of x is the adjacent over the hypotenuse. Adjacent means next to. So when you talk about this angle, you're saying the side that's next to it, which is this side here, over the hypotenuse. So it's this one over this one. And these would be values. These would be actual numbers that would be labeled on the triangle. This is just in general. And this will make more sense as I talk more about it. And then you have the tangent. Tangent of x equals the opposite over the adjacent. And you kind of have to memorize these. So the tangent of x is the opposite side over the adjacent side. So it'd be this one over this one. So for example, if this were a 3, 4, 5 triangle, let's say this is 3, this is 4, this is 5. If you were talking about the sine of this angle, it would be the opposite over the hypotenuse. So in this case, it would be 3/5. If you were talking about the cosine of this angle, it would be the adjacent over the hypotenuse, so 4/5. And if you were talking about the tangent of this angle, it would be the opposite over the adjacent, so 3/4. Okay, so this is just ratios. That's all we're talking about. We're just talking about one side to another. I'm just going to give you one example of what I think makes the most sense when you talk about trigonometry and these ratios. This is a sort of a famous triangle that's worth knowing. It's called a 30, 60, 90. Again, you studied this in geometry class. If this were 30 degrees and this was 60 degrees, if you add this up, 30 and 60 is 90, plus this 90 is 180. The sum of the interior angles of every triangle is always 180 degrees. So this triangle has some special characteristics that are worth memorizing. And one of them is that when you draw a 30, 60, 90, it always happens that no matter what size this is right here, this length, this hypotenuse will always be twice as big. So if this was 10 inches long, this would be 20 inches long. If this were 50 feet, this would be 100 feet. And it's just the nature of this triangle. It's impossible to draw a 30, 60, 90 using a protractor and making sure this is exactly 60 and this is exactly 30. When you do that, it's impossible to not get it so that this is always half the length of this. This is half the length of this, or this is twice the length of this. And that's just, it's just by nature. It just occurs that way. It's impossible to draw it otherwise. So when you take the sine of 30 degrees, you'll get the opposite over the adjacent. So if this were 5, this would be 10. You'd get 5/10, which would reduce to 1/2. It'll always reduce to 1/2 because this length is always half the length of this one. And that's what we mean by trigonometry, that whatever angle you're talking about, there's certain ratios that hold true all the time. So with a 30-degree angle, the ratio of the opposite side to the hypotenuse is always going to be a 1-to-2 ratio. This will always be one part of the two parts that exist here. So if this is 5, this is 10. If this is 20, this is 40. And that's just the way it is. This is worth memorizing also. So the sine of 30 degrees is a half, and it'll always be a half. You can take your calculator and you can plug in, depending on the calculator, some say sine, and we're going to have to do this at some point anyway, so you might want to try it with your phone or with your calculator. Plug in sine and then 30 degrees. You have to make sure your calculator is in degrees. Somewhere on your calculator you'll see this as opposed to this, which I'll explain in another video. But for now, the calculator has to be in degrees or you won't get it. When you put in sine 30, it should say 0.5. Some calculators, you do 30 degrees and then you hit the sine function, and then you get the 0.5, and then hit equals, you get 0.5. So depending on your calculator or your phone, you're either doing sine of 30 or 30 sine, and you're going to get 0.5 because the ratio is always 1 to 2. Okay, so I'm going to leave it at that for this video. I think that this problem gives it the most meaning as in terms of showing you the ratio of one side to another. But what you should get out of this video is simply this here, and this is worth memorizing. So the sine is always opposite over hypotenuse, cosine is always adjacent over hypotenuse, and the tangent is opposite over adjacent.